The Child and the Beast Kingdom. The first time Jonah Mercer left the recovery chamber, he did so because Princess Elsin Valethorne refused to accept the authority of 3 decorated guardians, a royal physician, and common sense. "This is cruel," she declared. Nysera Draven did not look up from the document she was reviewing. "It is recovery. It is imprisonment with better lighting." Kalis, standing by the doorway with her arms folded, muttered, "I like her more every day." Maven did not glance up from the tactical display hovering over the chamber table. "That is because she says aloud what you merely weaponize through expression." "I do not weaponize expression. You absolutely do." Jonah, seated on the edge of the recovery couch and trying to fasten a fitted dark coat over healing ribs that still hated him personally, watched the exchange with something dangerously close to amusement. 6 days had passed since the Bloodward Covenant awakened. 6 days of medicine, rest, monitored movement, political explanations, and a degree of surveillance that made prison indeed feel like an unfair comparison to prison. He had learned the routines of the Umbralith by sound now. The low resonant pulse of the engines, the softer tonal shifts that marked changes in shield configuration, the whisper click of hidden doors opening to admitted personnel only. He had learned the 3 guardians in fragments as well. Nysera was discipline shaped into a person. Everything about her seemed measured. The angle of her posture, the rhythm of her speech, the exact degree of force with which she corrected both military failures and social stupidity. Yet there were moments, brief and almost invisible, when Jonah caught something warmer beneath the command steel. A hand adjusting a blanket without comment. A deliberate choice to answer his worst questions honestly, rather than kindly. Kalis was easier to read and more dangerous for it. Dry humor, restless violence held in elegant containment, the habit of prowling rather than walking when she thought no one important was watching. She had taken over most of Jonah's physical rehabilitation and appeared to consider suffering a valuable educational framework. Maven was the one who worried him most. Not because she was cruel, but because she saw too far. She spoke rarely unless something useful needed saying, and whenever she did, Jonah had the strong impression that she had already followed the conversation 7 moves ahead and was merely being polite enough to meet everyone else where they still were. And Elsin had become the axis around which the strange little orbit of his days turned. She visited often, sometimes with books written for royal children, which turned out to be unexpectedly helpful introductions to Valdir history, sometimes with questions about Earth, sometimes with no apparent purpose but company. She had a disconcerting way of moving from innocent curiosity to ancient formal language and back again in the same breath, as though she were still deciding which version of herself was safer to be. Today she stood in the middle of the chamber, in a dark, silver-trimmed tunic and boots, clearly selected for disobedient mobility. One hand on her hip in a posture she had almost certainly stolen from an adult who regretted it. "He is healed enough to see something besides walls," she said. "Even prisoners are allowed exercise." "He is not a prisoner," Nysera said. "Then stop guarding him like one." Nysera raised her eyes at last. "We are guarding him because there is an active extremist faction that would happily cut through 3 decks of royal steel to make an example of him." Elsin was silent for a beat. Then, more softly, "I know." The chamber changed at once. Jonah had seen it happen before. The instant she stopped being only a bold child and became the surviving target of an attempted political murder. Her face did not collapse. She had too much training for that. But something young moved behind her eyes then. Something that still remembered red lights and claws and the smell of smoke in a market corridor. Jonah set aside the coat fastening and spoke before the silence could harden into apology. "She's right." All 4 turned toward him. He resisted the urge to regret having chosen a side in a room full of heavily armed, immortal women. "I'm not saying take me to a public festival," he added, "or parade me through a hostile court. But I can walk now. Mostly. My lungs work. My organs seem committed to staying internal. If I have to be stuck aboard this ship, I'd like to at least know what kind of floating empire I'm stuck aboard." Kaelus's silver eyes narrowed in assessment. You can walk. Your definition of mostly remains suspicious. I have a very forgiving relationship with accuracy. That, Maven murmured, has been established. Nicera rose at last from the table and crossed the chamber. Her golden gaze swept over him in a commander's inventory: posture, color, steadiness, concealed pain level. From the bed to the corridor is not the same as from the corridor to the heart of a dread flagship, she said. I know. Do you? No, Jonah admitted, but I know enough to want to see it anyway. Nicera studied him for another second. Then, unexpectedly, she looked at Elsin. The princess straightened at once, as if realizing some judgment had finally reached her rank. If he is permitted movement, Nicera said, you will follow every instruction given. No wandering, no unsanctioned detours, no disappearing behind ceremonial architecture to prove a point. Elsin's expression became one of concentrated innocence. I never do that. Kaelus made a noise somewhere between a laugh and a choke. Maven said, without looking up, that is a lie so transparent it qualifies as decorative. Elsin lifted her chin. I occasionally do that. Nicera did not smile, but Jonah had come to recognize the near imperceptible softening around her eyes as the closest she reliably came. Then today, you occasionally will not. The princess brightened instantly. Jonah got to his feet too fast, the room lurched, and Kaelus caught him under one arm before he could make a humiliating contribution to the polished floor. Graceful, she said. I'm saving my elegance for court. That would imply you possess some. He straightened slowly, breathing through the pull in his chest, then took the dark coat from the bed and shrugged into it. It had been tailored for him aboard the ship, part human practicality, part Valdir severity. The fabric was lighter than it looked, black with a deep, muted sheen, closed asymmetrically across the chest to avoid pressure on the healing wounds beneath. Silver thread traced minimal lines at cuff and collar, not ornamental exactly, but too deliberate to be merely functional. The ward band Elsin had given him rested warm against his wrist where the sleeve pulled back. He noticed the princess watching him. What? She tilted her head, considering. You do not look like a mechanic. Jonah adjusted the collar. That's disappointing. It's one of my few reliable traits. You look, Elsin said, like someone important pretending not to be. The line landed strangely. Jonah glanced away first. Kaelus, of course, noticed. Children, she said dryly, are nature's preferred instruments for targeted injury. They did not take him through the main ceremonial arteries of the ship. Jonah suspected that if he had asked, Maven could have explained the security logic in 12 precisely ranked layers. Nicera simply called it the inner route. It led them through corridors unlike anything human military design would ever have produced. The Umbralith did not feel manufactured. It felt grown from intention. Walls curved like obsidian ribs, polished to a depth that sometimes reflected them and sometimes seemed to swallow reflection whole. Veins of faint silver fire ran beneath dark surfaces, pulsing in patient rhythms. Doorways did not slide open so much as divide soundlessly, like the ship itself had decided to make room. The air was cool and held traces of mineral incense, metal, and something older Jonah could not name, like old libraries after midnight or stones that had watched too many winters. He walked between Nicera and Kaelus, with Maven slightly behind and Elsin ranging where her guardianship would allow, which meant never quite out of reach and never fully still. Jonah noticed how others reacted as they passed. Crew members, officers, attendants, household functionaries, Valdir of every rank paused when they saw the princess and her escort. Most bowed. Some knelt. A few froze outright when their eyes landed on Jonah. Then their gazes dropped, almost involuntarily, to the ward band on his wrist. The reaction was immediate every time. Recognition. Shock. Calculation. Not hostility, usually. Not from those they passed here, but awareness sharpened like drawn wire. They all know what it means, Jonah murmured. Maven answered from behind him. Most know enough. That's not reassuring. It is not intended to reassure. Elsin slipped closer to his left side. Some of them are curious. About the human who took 12 plasma wounds and lived? Jonah asked. She nodded. And about why the old law answered you. He glanced down at her. You make that sound like it had a choice. Elsin looked up at him with disarming seriousness. Old things always have choices. Nicera did not correct her. That told Jonah more than he liked. They passed through an elongated gallery lined with tall alcoves. At first he thought they were sculptures, black figures shaped from some glossy mineral, their forms half-cloaked, half-armored, abstracted into symbols of war, mourning, and guardianship. Then he realized each alcove contained relics, weapons, crowns, torn standards sealed in shadow glass, a cracked mask of silver and bone. The history of a species displayed not as chronology, but as accumulated memory. He slowed without intending to. Keyless noticed immediately. Pain? No. Jonah nodded toward the alcoves. What is all this? The Hall of Bearing, Elsin answered before anyone else could. It keeps the things our people refuse to forget. Jonah looked at her. She said it with the confidence of a lesson memorized young, but there was a softness beneath it too, as though the idea meant more to her than ceremonial education alone. He stepped toward one of the alcoves. Behind the glass rested a child's coronet, small and dark, set with pale stones that did not glitter so much as hold trapped moonlight. One side was broken inward, as though struck. That was Queen Salith's, Elsin said quietly. Before she was queen, there was an attack in the lower court, and she shielded her younger brother with her head. The crown broke before her skull did. Jonah turned back to her slowly. She was a child. Yes, and that's in a hall of honored relics. Elsin nodded. Jonah looked again at the broken coronet. The Beast Kingdom, he thought. That was what humanity called them in the outer worlds when fear wanted poetry. The Nightborn, the Blood-throned, elegant monsters wearing empire-like skin. But this hall, this careful curation of wounds, sacrifices and losses not hidden but enshrined, did not belong to beasts who gloried only in power. It belonged to a people obsessed with remembrance. The thought came unbidden. What kind of monsters build museums for the things that hurt them? Before he could shape the question aloud, Nicera answered the thought he had not spoken. The civilized kind, she said. Jonah glanced at her. She stood beside him without pretense, eyes on the broken coronet, her face unreadable except for that familiar trace of old discipline. Our enemies call us weak for preserving such things, she said. Some within our own bloodlines agree with them. They believe memory softens judgment. And you? Nicera's gaze remained on the relic. I believe forgetting is what makes monsters convenient. Jonah felt that settle somewhere deep. Elsin reached for his hand then, not the injured one, but the other, and tugged him onward before the moment could harden. There is better than dead crowns, she announced. Kalis sighed. That sentence is uniquely royal. It is true. This I believe. The next chamber opened into a garden. Jonah stopped dead. Not because he was in pain. Not even because he was surprised, though surprise certainly played its part. He stopped because nothing in his understanding of a worship had prepared him for an interior night garden the size of a transit concourse. Black stone gave way to living ground. Trees rose from carefully terraced beds, their trunks pale silver and smooth as bone, their branches hung with leaves so dark green they read almost black until the light touched them. Water moved through narrow channels cut in elegant curves, reflecting the ceiling above, a vaulted dome of dark crystal through which stars shone. Not projected stars, real ones, or something so perfectly rendered his eyes could not tell the difference. White flowers opened in clusters along the walkways, their petals emitting a faint lunar glow. Small winged creatures, translucent and delicate as blown glass, drifted between branches carrying bioluminescence in their bellies. Jonah stared upward. This is inside the ship. Elsin looked delighted by his reaction. Yes. How? Kalis answered with great satisfaction, very expensively. Maven added, the Arboretum predates this vessel's current military configuration. The Umbralith was originally commissioned as a sovereign house carrier. It was later adapted for strategic command. Jonah looked around the garden again. So your people built a palace, he's then added guns. Kalis considered. That is offensively reductive. Is it inaccurate? She thought about it. No. Elsin pulled him toward a winding path lined with black lilies and low silver-leafed shrubs. This is one of the matriarch's gardens. Jonah slowed. We're allowed in one of the matriarch's gardens? Allowed is a flexible word, Kalis said. She allows me? Elsin corrected. That, Maven said, is because denying you access would consume more resources than permitting it. The princess ignored her magnificently. Jonah took a careful breath of the cool, fragrant air. It smelled of wet stone, night-blooming flowers, and something else. Earth, actual earth, rich and old and living. Not sterilized hydroponic substrate. Not station-grown tray moss, soil. He had not realized how much he missed the smell until it reached him. A wave of homesickness moved through him then, so sudden and absurd it almost bent his knees. Not for any particular place. Just for ground. For the idea of a world that stayed still while you stood on it. Perhaps Elsin felt the change in his hand because she looked up and asked, much more gently than before, "Does it hurt?" He followed her gaze, thinking she meant his scars. Then he understood. Not the body, the distance. Sometimes, he admitted. She nodded as if he had said something dignified rather than obvious. Mother says missing a place means it shaped you well. Jonah looked down at her. Your mother says a lot of wise things. She says them after being angry first, usually. Kalis barked a short laugh. Nisera hid the shape of hers by turning slightly away. The path curved around a central pool, dark as polished onyx. Something floated at its center. A single stone bowl burning with pale silver fire that gave off no smoke. Jonah's eyes fixed on it. That, said a voice from the far side of the water, was lit on the night my granddaughter was born. Everybody in the garden changed. Not dramatically. There was no scramble, no startled reaching for weapons, but every line of posture sharpened. Every breath became formal. Even the air seemed to gather itself. Jonah turned. High Matriarch Elsin Valethorne stood beneath a flowering tree whose white petals glowed against the darkness like captive snow. She wore no crown. The absence made her more formidable, not less. Her gown fell in layered black that drank the starlight and returned it in a faint sheen like oil on water. Silver traced the edges so subtly it appeared only when she moved. Her hair was pinned back in part and left loose in part, dark as midnight over her shoulders. The scars at her temple, those faint silver marks Jonah had seen in reflection, caught the garden light like hairline fractures in polished stone. But it was her stillness that struck him most. Everyone else in the garden occupied space. Elira commanded it merely by remaining within it. Her golden eyes moved first to Elsin, softening by a fraction so slight Jonah might have imagined it. Then to him. The softness vanished, but not into coldness. Into attention. Your Majesty, Nisera said, bowing deeply. Kalis and Maven followed at once. Jonah, who had been coached on court forms, but not on the proper etiquette for accidentally encountering an immortal ruler in her own starlit garden while half-healed and emotionally compromised by flowers, did the only thing available to him. He bowed. Not elegantly, not perfectly, but sincerely. When he straightened, Elira was still watching him. Jonah Mercer, she said. Her voice was lower than he expected. Not theatrical, not sharpened for intimidation. It carried weight without needing to display it. High Matriarch, he answered. Elsin, apparently untroubled by any of this, released Jonah's hand and crossed directly to her grandmother. Elira extended one arm without looking away from Jonah, and the child moved into the space beside her with practiced familiarity, leaning lightly against the older woman's side. Only then did Elira speak again. You are walking. Jonah glanced down at himself as if to verify. That seems to be the current trend. For one dangerous second he thought he had overstepped catastrophically. Then something impossible happened. The High Matriarch's mouth curved. Not fully, not warmly, but undeniably. A surviving wit, she said. Your healers will be disappointed. Kalis lowered her head fast enough to hide what was very clearly a smile. Jonah, uncertain whether he had just passed or failed some invisible threshold, settled for honesty. I suspect my healers have had broader disappointments. Elira's gaze sharpened with interest. Yes, she said softly. I imagine they have. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Testing silence. Jonah had the uncanny sense that the garden itself was listening. Elsin tipped her face upward. Grandmother, I brought him to see the kingdom that is not beastly." Nicera closed her eyes very briefly. Kalis looked delighted. Maven visibly recalculated how much disaster could emerge from a single child's sentence. Jonah felt every instinct he possessed advise immediate disappearance. Elira, however, looked down at Elsin rather than outward at the rest of them. "And what," she asked, "have you shown him so far?" "The Hall of Bearing, and the trees, and the light pool. He likes the flowers, but has not said so, because he still thinks being impressed is a kind of vulnerability." Jonah inhaled once through his nose. "Highness, you see," Elsin said to her grandmother. "He does that." The impossible thing happened again. Elira smiled. This time it was sadder, older. "Many men do," she said. Then she looked back at Jonah, and the smile faded not into dismissal, but into something much more difficult to endure, understanding. "You have heard what humanity calls us," she said. It was not phrased as a question. Jonah hesitated. In any safer conversation he might have lied, softened it, chosen diplomacy over truth. But something in Elira's bearing told him that false comfort would insult her more than fear ever could. "Yes, say it." Nicera's head lifted sharply. "Majesty." Elira stilled her with the slightest motion of 2 fingers. Jonah met the matriarch's gaze. "The Beast Kingdom," he said. The words sounded uglier in the garden than they had ever sounded in a dockside bar. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Elsin pressed closer against Elira's side, not frightened, but listening with the grave attention of a child who understands that truths are being handled. At last, Elira turned her eyes toward the silver-burning bowl in the pool. "Do you know," she asked, "what beasts do not keep?" Jonah waited. "Records of their dead," she said. "Gardens for contemplation, laws that bind power to gratitude, relics of shame, names of those they failed." Her voice remained calm, but beneath it, something vast moved. "Beasts consume," she continued. "They dominate what is before them and sleep without memory. Kingdoms, real kingdoms, must do harder things. They must remember. They must account. They must restrain what hunger makes easy." Her gaze returned to him. "My enemies call my people weakened by those disciplines. Some say I have made us too gentle. Others say I have made us hypocrites, predators draped in philosophy." Jonah swallowed. He did not know if he was being questioned, judged, instructed, or invited. Possibly all 4. Elira looked down at Elsin's hand where it rested against the dark fabric of her gown. "When I was young," she said, "and every person in the garden became absolutely still, I believed power would protect everything worth loving if I gathered enough of it." Jonah felt the shift at once. This was not court language now, not ceremony, not even politics. This was confession spoken so carefully it could pretend to be philosophy if anyone tried to survive it by misunderstanding. "I learned instead," Elira said, "that power protects very little unless it remembers why it exists." Her fingers brushed once over Elsin's hair. "Forgetting," she said, "is the first appetite of monsters." No one answered. The words seemed to enter the dark soil, the trees, the silver fire itself. Jonah looked at her then, not as sovereign, not as legend, not as the woman whose fleets could erase stations from maps, but as something stranger and more difficult, as a ruler actively fighting the corrosion of her own nature. He thought of the Hall of Bearing, of relics preserved not because they were victories, but because they were wounds, of Nicera saying forgetting was what made monsters convenient, of Elsin calling this a kingdom that was not beastly. And suddenly, quietly, he understood. Not all of it, not remotely all of it, but enough. "This place," he said slowly, "exists so you don't lose yourselves." A small silence answered him. Then Elira said, "Yes." Only that. But it changed something. She stepped around the pool and came closer, not too close. Enough that Jonah could see the minute silver scars at her temple, the impossible age held behind those golden eyes, the discipline in every line of her face. "You stood in a market and made a choice before you knew rank, title, or consequence," she said. "Do you know what that means to a ruler?" Jonah thought of the plasma fire, of Elsin's hand clutching his uniform, of the simple animal certainty that some things must not be allowed to happen while you still had a body to place in their way. "No," he admitted. It means, Elira said, that there are still beings in this universe who act from conscience before calculation. She lowered her gaze briefly to the ward band on his wrist. That is rarer than courage. Jonah did not know what to do with praise from someone like her, particularly not when it sounded less like flattery than grief relieved for one passing second. So he did the only thing he could. He answered with his own truth. I'm not noble, he said. I'm not a hero. I was scared out of my mind. Elira's expression did not change. Of course you were. He frowned. Something almost stern entered her gaze. Courage that feels nothing is merely design, she said. Courage that fears and remains, that is moral choice. The sentence entered him deeper than he wanted, because it did not merely honor what he had done, it absolved something. Not all his past, not his failures with Ava, not the years lost to shame and absence, but some small poisonous lie he had carried, that because fear had lived in him, goodness had not. Elsin slipped from Elira's side and came back to Jonah, tugging lightly at his sleeve. See, she whispered with childlike triumph. I told you she was not what people say. Nicera made a quiet sound that might have been warning or surrender. Jonah, astonishingly, found himself smiling. I'm beginning to notice that, Elira heard. Of course she heard. Her gaze shifted to her granddaughter, and in that look, Jonah saw something startling enough to make him ache. Not merely love, guarded love. Love that had survived centuries by becoming vigilant. Love that did not trust the world enough to relax its grip on tenderness. The beast kingdom, he thought again. No, not beasts. A people at war with what they might become if they ever stopped remembering. A child who had nearly died. A matriarch who preserved gardens and relics because memory was a form of moral law. A court split between those who saw mercy as civilization and those who called it rot. The realization did not make them harmless, it made them legible. And that was, perhaps, far more dangerous. Elira turned slightly away, eyes lifting to the stars above the glass dome. When you return to your own people, she said, they will ask you what you found among us. Jonah followed her gaze. The stars looked close enough to touch. What should I tell them? Elira's answer came without hesitation. Tell them, she said, that we are most dangerous when we forget what pain means. Then she looked back at him, and the full force of her ancient attention settled, not crushing, but exact. And tell them, she added, that I have not forgotten. The silver fire in the pool moved, though there was no wind. No one spoke after that. There was nothing to improve. After a moment, Elira rested one hand briefly atop Elsin's shoulder, a touch so fleeting it might have gone unnoticed if Jonah had not already learned how much this people said through restraint, and turned to leave. But before she did, she addressed Nicera without looking at her. Commander, Nicera bowed. Majesty. He may walk in the garden once each day under guard. Kalis glanced at Jonah with immediate irritation. You see, you collect permissions like a low-grade miracle. Maven said, technically that was not permission. It was royal directive. That is worse. Elira's gaze shifted just enough to indicate she had heard both. Then do not squander it, she said. The next moment she was gone into the dark-limbed path beyond the trees, moving with that impossible stillness only rulers and predators ever truly mastered. Elsin watched her grandmother disappear, then let out the breath she had evidently been holding. She is in a remembering mood, the princess said. Jonah looked down at her. Is that good? Elsin considered carefully. For the right people, yes. Kalis pinched the bridge of her nose. She says things like this, and then I am expected not to become superstitious. Maven adjusted a data slate against her hip. You are already superstitious. You simply prefer martial vocabulary for it. Nicera, watching the path Elira had taken, finally turned back to Jonah. Well, she said. Jonah waited. You wished to see the ship. He glanced around the silver-lit garden, the black water, the flowers glowing like captured moons. Yes. Nicera's golden eyes held his for a moment longer. And now, Jonah looked at the place again, not as architecture, not as spectacle, but as argument. A living argument against forgetting. Against the easy dehumanization of the feared. Against the lie that power and tenderness could not survive in the same bloodline. The answer came more quietly than he expected. "Now," he said, "I think I've started seeing the people." Elsin squeezed his hand in approval. And in the quiet center of the Umbralith, beneath stars carried through war, among gardens cultivated against monstrosity, Jonah Mercer stood inside the Beast Kingdom and began, for the first time, to understand that the truest battles there were not fought only with blades, blood, or empire, but with memory.